We had a very tough start this morning, not tough in terms of the events, but tough conversations to be had about Africa's progress, right? We are taking that into the next set of panel sessions that we'll be having. And first on the list is this panel session on green industrialization in Africa, addressing informal mining and the resource course. And we have no other person than a very esteemed guest to chair that panel in the person of Dr. Isaac Ziaba. He is a teaching and research fellow with the Methodology Department of the London School of Economics and Political Science. He'll be making his way to the stage shortly. Yes, I'll read a bit about his profile. Not only is he a teaching and research fellow, but he's also examining the socio-political and economic dynamics of mining, focusing on how ethno-geographic cleavages shape state response to rights issues. He is currently completing a British Academy-funded project on why liberal democracies appropriate the property rights of licensed mining companies, using Ghana as a case study. All of this and more will be sharing with us today in conversation with his panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, join me to welcome Dr. Isaac Ziaba, the chair for this panel.
All right, so thank you guys for making it to this panel. We are really privileged to be sharing our insights on the implication of green industrialization for Africa's extractive industry, et cetera. So, I mean, a lot has been said about me already. So this panel basically explores how Africa can transition from extractive dependence to green industrialization, ensuring that natural resources drive sustainable economic transformation, and I think that's what we've been hoping for centuries. So central to today's discussion is the role of artisanal and small-scale mining, which is often informal and yet deeply embedded in African economies, particularly in rural areas. So we will examine the environmental, political, and socio-economic implications of informal mining. We would examine the pathways for formalization without marginalization, but also explore how Africa can move beyond raw material export through value addition and equitable governance. The section will highlight our policies, regional frameworks, and international dynamics, including the presence of Chinese, but also Western mining capital in Africa's natural resource landscape, shape the continent's green transition. So with me here are three panel members. Beginning to my left, we have Miss Josephine Shinami. I hope I got it right. The Mrs. or Miss? Okay. So Josephine is an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity. She's a social justice and movement lawyer with expertise in business and human rights, climate change, climate justice, environmental child rights, and sustainable and equitable natural resource governance. Previously, she led the Responsible Investments and Business Program at the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. So she will be bringing to the discussion, the Zimbabwean case more particularly. Then we have Professor Emil Lebjiu, who is an economist with the University of Oxford, where he also serves as the Director for Technology and Industrialization for Development. His research focuses on industrial policy, energy transitions, and natural resource management. He's the author of Survival of the Greenest. That's interesting. Economic transformation in a climate-conscious world. So he is bringing to bear on the discussion the academic lens, but he also engages a lot with policymakers that contribute to green transition in Africa. And finally, we have, an industrial practitioner, Mr. Godwin Nicholson Amar, who is the General Secretary of Ghana National Association of Small-Scale Miners, NASM to be short. And this organization is the foremost organization in Africa, in Ghana, representing the interests of small-scale mining companies. Mr. Amar holds certificate in mine management, mining law, creative leadership, entrepreneurship, conflict resolution, etc., etc. He's the CEO and founder of Transenco Minerals and Mining Limited, and also the founder of Gold God Entertainment Limited. And so we hope to sort of, draw upon his wealth of experience when it comes to mining, and particularly the implication of, again, green industrialization for his area of work. All right, so without much ado, we shall look at the various thematic areas under which we're going to be asking very important questions. So we have 4 thematic areas on green industrialization and mining, informal mining inequality and local economies, resource loss, illicit financial flows, and external influence, as well as governance and policy reform. So we begin with the first thematic area on green industrialization and mining. And the first question is, what does green industrialization mean for Africa's extractive industries, and how can it be leveraged to promote economic transformation rather than perpetuate dependency? So this question is particularly targeted to Dr. Amil, but with comments from the rest of the panel members.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I forgot to ask you, is it recorded or no?
Is it recorded?
It changes the nature of the answers. All right,
So it's recorded.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be back at LSE. I had the pleasure to work here 5 years ago, and I see some familiar faces of students from recent lectures. This panel, I hope, is really an opportunity to debunk some of the myths and misconceptions around natural resources in Africa. And the question you asked is extremely important, because you ask, what does it mean? And in fact, the big problem nowadays is that the current discourse around green industrialization or green development in Africa is not really driven by Africans, or it's not really owned by Africans. Very often it's kind of this global idea of what greening even means. But even what green means, it's highly time and space specific. What is green in Europe, what is green in terms of emissions reductions, might not be green in Namibia because of water scarcity issues. It might not be green because of material waste and pollution and the effects of mining. And I think that's the first really important step of what does green industrialization mean for different stakeholders on the continent. And perhaps in the way of not giving not providing the answers, because it's a long debate and up for each person to contribute, but just to open up 2 areas for discussion. We often think of green industrialization solely in the context of low carbon industries, right? Manufacturing solar panels, wind turbines, or extracting cobalt and making it into batteries. But it suffers from the carbon tunnel vision, right? And very often we don't address other ecological goals like material waste, biodiversity loss, which there's a lot of developmental industrial opportunities around it. One of them is thinking about basically dematerialized industries, right? Or the whole circular economy of product durability. And this is when there's a great entry door for many African communities, African nations, where in contrast to their peers globally, have you ever tried to repair your phone or your computer here in the UK? Good luck. You take it, even if it's a little scratch. No. You got to replace everything.
Yeah.
But in most places in Africa, you can get anything repaired. You don't know how, but you can get it repaired, right?
Yeah.
But this is often associated with the informal economy.
Yeah.
But this is great skill, right? And this is an asset, not something to kind of, be pushed aside when you think about productivity. That's something to leverage, because that also is what greening means, right? If you can produce a product, a fridge, a piece of electronic that can last 4 times longer than the norm, that's pretty green to me.
Yeah.
So there are many ways in which this can be adapted, and of course one of them is leveraging natural resources. But as we'll talk later, I don't think it's all about natural resources.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Professor Green. Amil, so I will take the next comment from Josephine.
Okay. Thank you. It's great to be back in the old building again. I was a student here up until last year, so it's good to be back. For me, when I was considering this question, I looked at when this discussion about the opportunities for Africa and the green industrialization, the conversation is mostly around the critical minerals or the rare earth minerals that are needed for the transition to renewable energies and technologies and things like that. So when I looked at that, I considered that this is not the first time that Africa minerals that are needed by other countries are discovered in Africa. It has always been there. So it got me to think that for it to benefit Africa, for it to change the trajectory of the continent, we have to consider why has mineral wealth or natural resources in Africa have not benefited the continent before. So in considering that, I was reminded of what Walter Rodney wrote many decades ago about how, the African natural resources, the system was designed, like the global economic system was designed not for Africa to benefit from its own resources, but for it to be extracted and benefit elsewhere, and for its labor to be extracted elsewhere again. So I looked at, for us to see a benefit of this green industrialization and how our minerals can change the continent, we have to confront these systems and confront some of these questions. Why have we not done that before? I come from Zimbabwe, where we discovered diamonds, and everyone was like, yes, the country is going to prosper now, but it hasn't really happened because of internal and external problems. So I looked at it from the perspective that if we want to see a change based on these green minerals and this green industrialization move, we have to look at internally and externally as to why haven't we progressed before, because it's not the first time that these minerals are being discovered on the continent anyway. So, yeah.
Thank you, Josephine. And I think perhaps the question you asked could perhaps better be answered by Godwin in terms of looking at things from the domestic realm, in terms of what we can do domestically to ensure that our resources benefit us. But you're not constrained in answering that question. You could give a general insight on what green industrialization means for the extractive industry. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for having me here, and I will say good morning. I'm from the Ghana National Association of Small Scale Miners to you all. My first question is this. Asia or China has got a plan for Africa. Europe has got plans for Africa when it comes to exploration of our resources. But what do Africans, what plan do we have towards these countries in terms of exploration of our resources? If we don't have a plan, then anything goes. So the continent needs to have its own plan towards Europe, Asia, and the Americans in terms of exploration of our resources. Then that will really change the trajectory of our conversation on the continent. The African mining vision, we have the mining vision, which we look at the country mining visions and all that. But when it comes to Ghana, I would say green, as the word green, everyone is talking about green, and I'm in the gold mining sector and then the diamonds, and now the issue of traceability, where consumers or customers, they want to know where you are mining and what sort of environmental impact do your mining have on the environment, and how are the communities that you are mining in benefiting from the resources that we are taking out from their communities. Then the issue of governance is also. So green means working without using harmful chemicals, for instance, like mercury, which is mainly found within artisanal and small-scale mining sector. Our countries have signed on the Minamata Convention to gradually reduce the use of mercury, and the metal mercury, its effects on the health and safety of communities and the miners themselves. So the association, in working closely with the EPA and the Minerals Commission and government, working and building capacity, bringing out alternative use in terms of mercury-free techniques that we use in our mining. So now you have shaker tables, you have equipment like the gold catcher that you don't use mercury as that is what for the final process of your concentrate. When it comes to community, the communities and then the small-scale miners themselves, we have what we've started called the community apprenticeship programs, where you as an entity, you work closely with the community, and we train some of the community folks and employ them within our operations. So for instance, my end at Transeco, we've trained about 20 community guys into excavator operation, welding and all that, and we've employed them on artisanal and small scale mines, so that at the end of the day, we leave skills into the community. Then when it comes to environmental degradation, anytime you hear artisanal and small scale mining, what comes to mind first is crude methods of working and also environmental degradation. But now we are also posting bonds where the EPA, working with the Association and Small Scale Miners, to post bonds for reclamation. And we have concurrent reclamation that the association and then the small scale miners are been building capacity to, you mine and then you reclaim and then you replant so that the land will also go back to use. And then value addition is also one of the areas that we're looking at, where our minerals that we get as small scale operators, we are working with our local jewelers to add value. If you don't add value and you export raw, I must say 40% of gold produced in the country, which amounts to an average of 1.2 million ounces, comes from the small-scale mining sector. And these are all exported raw. If you add it to the large-scale company, you are looking at an average of 2.5 million ounces of gold that goes off to other countries raw. So when it goes raw, we also export the job opportunities for our people. So let me end here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Goldwyn, for such an elaborative response. So I have a very quick follow-up, and I think this is directly oriented towards Dr. Amil. So we know that much of the world's critical minerals are sort of, located in geographically unstable, countries such as the DRC. The DRC, in fact, is sitting on some more than half of the world's deposit of cobalt, which obviously is needed in the technology industry. So my question is, Dr. Amil, how does the growing demand for critical minerals, such as cobalt, coltan, et cetera, impact mineral-rich, unstable countries such as the DRC?
No, that's a very good question. Just before I answer it, there's the resource curse background element, which is also in the title. But in the room, can you raise your hand if you think that natural resources are a curse for development? Okay, can you raise your hand if you think that they're a blessing for development? All right, more optimists in the room. And can you raise your hand if you think that it's neither? Okay, so a good portion. There's a kind of idea there that, the whole literature on resource curse, which it's highly problematic in the sense that the real issue for development is depending on natural resources, right? Not necessarily having them. And historically, even the studies that have shown that there is a resource curse, what they're actually looking at is not the abundance of natural resources, it's how much countries depend on them. So you have countries that are very poor and have very little natural resources, but they overly depend on those little natural resources, and it kind of leads to this misconception or this anomaly that, of course, they're poor because they have these natural resources, but it's not the case. And then going back to critical minerals, one of the big questions is, it's critical for whom, right? And some countries, as you said, countries have plans, There are lists. Governments have their list of which minerals they consider critical. As you have the UK list, the US, Canada. There's very few lists on the African continent to say which minerals are critical to us, right? And therefore, you always consider the things that are strategic because they're strategic to someone else. And one of the big dangers with critical minerals, of course, there is a great opportunity. I think most of the people in the room would have known about, the fact that they're needed as an input for low carbon technologies, consumer electronics, defense. But the problem with criticality is that it's really temporal. So what's critical today might not be critical tomorrow. And that's a normal thing, right? It happens with technological innovation, disruption. So cobalt is a perfect example. Today there's a big hype. Cobalt, a few decades ago, used to be needed for magnets, right? You needed cobalt for magnets. There was a supply disruption from the DRC because of a conflict in the north. So less cobalt available, scientists figured out how to build magnets without cobalt, right? And the value of cobalt plummeted. It happens across all sorts of critical minerals. It happened with nitrate in Chile. Scientist Fritz Haber figured out how to synthesize nitrate. Suddenly natural nitrate exports and value dropped. And today cobalt, you need it in batteries, but there is a lot of research being put into batteries that don't need any cobalt. Same with lithium, there is a lot of investment in solid-state batteries that don't have lithium. What will happen once if those technologies actually become cost competitiveness? All these critical minerals that African governments have seen as their entry door to industrialization that strategy would lose out. And this is why we have to be really careful in terms of which minerals actually will have a broad use, which ones are really vulnerable to disruptions. And this is where technological foresight units are really needed inside government so that they can actually plan according to different scenarios.
All right, thank you, Dr. Amir. I think we'll quickly move on to our second thematic area because of time. So, Mr. Amar talked about, formal mining or small-scale mining and the role that it is playing, but also its impact on environmental degradation. But I think it would be interesting to unpack what, formal small-scale mining is vis-a-vis informal small-scale mining. I will give you the platform to talk, and then Josephine would also give a contribution.
Okay. When we talk about formality, we look at following processes and procedures within a legal framework that gives you the right as an entity to mine.
Yeah.
Be large scale, small scale, medium scale, and all that. So then when it comes to informals, the informality or informal artisanal and small scale mining, those who are mining outside the legal framework that have been given. Because, for instance, if you look at the Minerals and Mining Act of Ghana, it specifies who qualifies to be a small-scale miner by law. You should be 18 years and above, you should have seen mine, and the concession size that is given is also 25 acres. But the challenge you are having is there's different form of ASM definitions on the continent. Some looking at the depth that will be going, some are looking at the kind of equipment that you are using, also looking at the investment. But for Ghana, we are looking at the size, 25 acres. You shouldn't go more than 25 acres. And the level of investment, equipment, and all that is used, you can still use them. So you have the mechanical shovels and going deep undergrounds and all that you can do. So the formalization process is to go through. But I look at formal informality. You have some that will start with the legal process but don't comply to the compliance to the legal framework, like don't mine on river bodies, how to kettle your tailings, management properly, recycling ponds and all that. Although the entity has got a license but may not follow the process and procedures, that's why I'm looking at formal but there are informalities in there, compared to the large-scale operations where taxes are paid, health and safety issues are looked at and all that. But within the small-scale mining sector, it becomes a challenge. But if you look at the way we categorize what we have in our country, myself, I look at it and I categorize. We have those who are doing fully mechanized operations under the small scale sector. You are doing those who are doing semi-mechanized operations and artisanal mining operations. And there are distinctions. Most of these formalized ASM operations are being handled by entrepreneurs. You see them, and they bring more than 125 acres. They have about 4 or 5 concessions together. You realize that they pay taxes and all that.
So they are not artisanal.
They are not artisanal. They are not using basic tools and all that. And investment that you look at, for instance, my end, I invest over $6 million into my mine's operations. You have highly skilled workers in there, and then you pay your taxes and all that. You compare to those who are doing semi-mechanized. Yes, they've got a license operating, but some of the compliance issues in terms of health and safety, fair pay and all that, in wages are not all there. So it's a work in progress. Yeah. If you look at formalization, it's a work in progress. You can't say, yes, the artisanal and small-scale mining sector is formalized. Yeah. It's formalized to a level, but when it comes to the informality, they realize that the person having got license to operate, they operate areas that they are not supposed to be, because you have the environmental permit that spells where you should work and where not to work. They really don't care. And some of the causes are because of the high price of gold that you get. Areas that tend to be not be viable now are viable, so you see them moving towards that for survival, to mine. Some are mining on the river bodies, and I can tell you about 70% of our river bodies, as you know, are gone because of dredging in the river bodies, and which is illegal operations. So we need to also build capacity and create a lot of awareness. And it's not only Ghana. Everywhere on the continent I've visited, you have this sort of informality associated with the ASM operations, human rights abuses and all that. And so I think we need to do more. But my practice side, the informality, through basic steps that we put in place, we'll be able to let most of them work in a proper manner.
All right, thank you so much. So Josephine, can you very quickly walk us through the sort of distinction between formal and informal mining, bringing the Zimbabwean case, to perspective? Yeah.
Okay, I think for the case of Zimbabwe, and I think most places in the continent, you cannot distinguish formal and informal mining without looking at the history of mining itself in the country. So if you look at how the country Zimbabwe came into being, it was colonized, I must say, by the British, and the basis of the colonization was a mining charter that was given to a company, the British South Africa Company, got a mining charter. So it came into a community where they were doing mining already, which we now term artisanal and small-scale mining. But now they have a charter. They can displace you to say, no, we have the right, the legal right of this charter that we have, powered by the Queen of Britain, who most indigenous people had not heard about, but they have the power to displace you and continue their mining. And that was the beginning of most large-scale mining that continued to happen in the country. But now we have a people, communities who for generations were mining, and also communities who, because of the economy and because of the different impacts that are happening on the agriculture sector, now need to be involved as well in the mining sector. But the laws that are there to permit them to enter into the sector are not relaxed, despite having one independence and everything. They are still based on that old colonial structure. So you then have people who just, because the gold is there and it's in their community, they just go and dig it up and start mining. So I think we need to look at it in defining formal and informal from also the history of the different restrictions, the barriers that are there for the locals to participate in the mining sector. So that's how maybe I can say the informal and formal mining sort of generated in Zimbabwe as a way of, them wanting to participate, others wanting to participate in the mining sector, but the current mining laws that we have are restrictive in the sense that they are more amenable to large-scale mining as opposed to small-scale mining that they want to be involved in. So,
all right, thank you so very much. So it seems to me that you are arguing that the laws in general are not amenable to the operations of communities, and thus becomes an incentive for communities to engage in informal mining.
Yes.
Because they can meet the minimum legal threshold.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Before I come to Dr. Emil, I have a question to Godwin. So Ghana reportedly lost $5 billion in gold-related illicit financial flows or smuggling in a single year. What mineral marketing and regulatory reforms are needed to reduce such losses and ensure that minerals sort of, benefit citizens?
Yeah, I think the gold trading sector in Ghana is informal. You have everyone in the market buying, but you can only ship through the PMMC, who is the government ASEA and also the exporter, although we had other companies that were also licensed to do that. But government brought a policy of taking 3% withholding tax in 2021. And if you look at the average gold production from 2020, from 2015, it was around 30% of the total gold produced. The moment government introduced the withholding tax,
30% produced by the small-scale miners?
Yes, small-scale miners, 30% of the total gold produced. So you don't have a single large-scale company that competes with the small-scale as a unit. If you have 3 ounces of gold produced, 1 for the country, 1 is coming from the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. So government brought 3% withholding tax, and we even advise that once you bring the 3% withholding tax, the cascading effect on the small-scale miners will be higher. So they should reduce it. And it will also give incentive for people to smuggle the gold out, because the small-scale miners produce, it goes to aggregators, so then the aggregators will export. If you give 3% and they are paying all that taxes. So at the market, they will be getting a discount of over 5%. We don't have a proper policy regime to ensure that there's traceability from where you buy the gold and where it ends up to. So what then happened? 3% on a margin. If you produce even 2.5 billion at the end of the year, you are looking at close to 70 million. That will be gains if it doesn't go through government. So that happened. So 2021, with the introduction, we had 3.86% of the gold produced coming straight down from 30% to 3.86% if you look at the data in 2020. So it means most of them were smuggled out because of the 3% that they will be making. Why? So if you don't, as a government, if you don't work closely with the industry to understand the dynamics, you bring policies that misaligns with the reality on the ground. So we lost in terms of the forex. Then, after having sort of engagement, they reduced it to 1.5 and realized that the next year it went to 18%. Then the following year it went to 20%. The government brought another policy called the gold for oil, gold for forest, and then gold for reserve. And that one also is only 4 or 5 companies where we're given the right to buy gold and then also export them. So that also contributed to we losing some sort of money. And the data from the PMMC shows that in 2022, the gold sales that went through the PMMC amounted to over $900 million US. But when you check from India, for instance, who bought, we normally send our gold, our Dory gold to, they were recording over $1.5 billion US. So you are looking at the difference of over $600 million. Where did it go to? It went through other countries, especially through Togo, to some of this. But when you get to India, you need to get the certificate of origin and all these good companies. So they'll tell you, we imported them from Ghana. So then you'll be able to get what went on our official channels and then the ones that went through that. So government is looking at bringing a new policy, if I can, like the gold board as one of the intervention. Now, the withholding tax have been taken off. You don't have any withholding tax there. Then the gold board is a board that is purely buying and exporting. It's only government. So all the small-scale miners and then some of the large-scale companies, through government preemption rights under the Minerals and Mining Act, will be able to purchase the gold from there to export. Last year, 2024, we made about $4.6 billion US. So we are looking at getting the gold board when everything goes according to plan. Then we will increase it from 4.6 billion to close to 9 billion in terms of forex coming into Ghana. And the gold board formation, you have the supply chain. It's basically looking at the downstream trading, value addition, and also sustainability, traceability. All this is under the ambient of the gold board. And then you have the supply chain operators as part and parcel of the gold board. We have the Small Scale Miners Association represented. We have the Chamber of Mines that represent the large scale. You have the Jewelers Association, PMMC, government agency, and all that to form the gold board. Great. To ensure that we manage it properly. Great. So it's something that has passed through Parliament, and the bill is out now. It was passed yesterday.
Thank you so much, Mr. Godwin. I find the gold board, initiative a bit, intriguing, but I think maybe the audience may have questions about how that kind of impedes on trade liberalization or economic liberalization. Like you have a government that is now going to monopolize the purchases of gold, etc., etc. What does that mean for economic liberalization in a neoliberal, world? But I have a question for Dr. Emile, which is how has the presence of Chinese and Western mining enterprises influenced the dynamics of mining and the resource curse in Africa?
That's a controversial question.
Yeah.
It's a good point to raise. My perception is that diversification of partners is good, and it's actually really needed to exercise some agency in your development. And in many ways, who's really bothered by Chinese presence in Africa tends to be the Europeans and the Americans, no? And saying that it's bad is not the good news. It's not good news for them, for sure. But if you look at the evidence, including on what some of you may already know about these resource-backed loans, so there's been a lot of criticism that loans by China basically have natural resources or infrastructure as collaterals, and therefore if you can't pay back, they seize your ports and your mines and so on. But some of the recent evidence looking at thousands of loans from China in Africa show that actually the repayments has been quite good. There hasn't been, this is not outside of the norm compared to loans by other lenders. So there is a big anti-China sentiment too. But that is not to say that this will lead to productive outcome unless African governments have a really strong vision of how to include those partnerships in their development goals. You mentioned Africa Mining Vision, which is a really important exercise at a regional level, but you also need many visions and plans at the national level in terms of what deal are you making, what leverage do you have?
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't have leverage, and that's fine, but sometimes you do. But African governments haven't been exercising that leverage as much as other countries, including, for example, Indonesia. And that example, if I have time to mention, Indonesia has done something interesting with nickel and bauxite, where it had an export ban, right? It was a disaster for bauxite, right? Basically, they banned the export of raw bauxite, right, to attract investment, to add value. But because bauxite, you find it everywhere, so no one came. With nickel, Indonesia has a large share of world nickel reserves, so Chinese investors had to agree. In Africa, many governments, including Zimbabwe and others, have imposed export bans, but not always strategically in terms of where they actually want to add value and where it made sense for them. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And as a Mauritian economist once told me, having a vision is good, but too many visions lead to hallucinations. So that's when clarity and long-term horizon is essential.
Great. Thank you so much. One thing I've observed, researching, going back to informal mining now, artisanal small-scale mining in Africa, is the ways in which African governments often, militarized responses towards informal miners, right? And we've observed this in Ghana in the last, 7 or 8 years. The military was deployed to sort of sanitize informal mining, whatever that meant. Maybe Godwin can help us. But Josephine, could you quickly take us through how this kind of play out in Zimbabwe? How have the Zimbabwean government militarized responses to informal miners?
Okay, thank you. I think it plays out in the sense that most of informal mining that happens in Zimbabwe is illegal, right? So since it's illegal, the police and sometimes the military has to come in to effect arrests and sort of bring order within the space, right? So we have seen over the years a heavy-handedness on the police as well as the military within the mining sector. And this did not just happen within the gold sector. We have seen it happen in the diamond sector as well. When diamonds were discovered in Chiadzwa, it was mostly artisanal mining because it's alluvial diamond where you don't need complicated machinery, to mine it. So it was mostly artisanal mining, and it was illegal, and we have seen a lot of the military being deployed within that area to set order. So whilst we have seen the involvement, and this has resulted in so many arrests and other human rights abuses with miners being beaten by dogs or being beaten nearly to death by the forces. But we have seen also this has instigated a response from the miners itself, which has contributed to the violence within the sector. Because to arm themselves and protect themselves from the police and the military, they have also formed what are called machete gangs. They've armed themselves with machetes and sometimes with even guns to respond to the militarization or to the involvement of the police and the military. And this in turn had contributed to the insecurity within the communities. So basically it's cycles of violence producing other cycles of violence. That's how I can best describe how it had played out in Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Before Godwin comes in, how much time have you got? How much time do we have? Please keep me the time. I just want to make sure that we're working within time. Okay, so Godwin, maybe in the next 1 minute, can you, or maybe 2 minutes, can you walk us through how the militarization of the informal mining sector in Africa has played out in Ghana?
Yeah, okay, thank you. It has been 30 years of using military.
30 years?
Yes, successive governments have used the military, and they've not been able to get rid of the illegality or the informality. It's a long term. You are using a short term gap for a long term challenge. You understand? So if you come in with the military, they stay for a month or two and they leave. What happens after that? So it's a knee-jerk form of approach in dealing with the. But we need to have a proper plan for the long-term solution. Although it's a national challenge, but the solution is at the local level. We need to equip the local, especially the district chief executives. That is the presence of the states at the local levels for them to be effective. But when it comes from like the central government, they are not involved. You will be there, they bring the military, they do whatever. There are human rights abuses, excavators being picked. We have a lot of court cases against government for banning equipment and investment of small-scale miners, which we know some of them we've won the cases and government have paid huge sums of money for the legal miners. So military doesn't really solve the problem. We need to empower the community in what we put a program called community empowerment enforcement solutions, where communities come together and we build their capacity, sensitize them for them to understand the pros and cons of this issue of illegal mining and its effects on agriculture, your land, your water body, and also some of the health hazards that is come. Once they are empowered, they help to reduce the issue of the illegal mining in their communities. And then the district chief executives, which represents government at that level, there should be the key performance indicators for them, the KPIs for them. Yeah. You cannot say you are a district chief executive and be at your backyard, there's so much illegal mining, environmental degradation and all. Then what is the presence of the states there? So we need to look at long-term solutions than the short-term solutions.
I think we have about 5 minutes to end the conversation and maybe 15 minutes for Q&A, right? Oh, okay, so I'll ask my last question, which I think is more oriented to Dr. Emile, but Godwin can also bring, his practical experience to bear on this question. I think generally development economists, concur that beyond maintaining macroeconomic stability and providing public goods and services, the state also ought to direct resources into strategic, investment in ways that promote domestic capital formation, which is, an engine of economic development. So my question is, how can African states promote domestic capital formation around mining or their minerals, to be precise, in ways that facilitate economic transformation? I hope the question is clear. Okay, so Dr. Emile.
Ambitious question, but clear. Back to your question, sounds very much like what should be the next book of David Luke, because he has How Africa Trades, How Africa Eats. Oh, okay. Next one may be How Africa Mobilizes Capital Formation for Development. These are great books, by the way, highly recommended. And that influenced a lot my thinking as well on those issues. So on capital formation, that's a very good question. Maybe the one thing I'll say is that not necessarily just about the mining, but the green industrialization in general. There is, so obviously, and it relates to your very first question, what do we mean by green industrialization? The motivation for green industrialization in Africa shouldn't be about emissions, right? Because the continent hasn't had the same historical responsibility for emissions, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't do it, right? Because there are other benefits in terms of employment, in terms of macroeconomic resilience. But the narrative around green industrialization often leads to this idea that they should be financed internationally, which from a justice point of view, money should come from richer nations to finance this agenda in Africa, but the money is not coming, right? It's even the money that was promised, right, and that are international agreements like the Copenhagen Summit, it's a fraction of the money that has arrived. So the fraction that goes to renewable energy investment in Africa is abysmal compared to what goes in North America, Europe, and so on. So that leads to domestic resource mobilization, and that there's so much to do on that front. And African governments a lot of them have sovereign wealth funds, that they created over the past 20 years. A lot of them have development banks, sometimes too many small development banks, but those are and central banks as well.
Yeah.
And those actors can play a proactive role in reorienting capital towards areas where you have a multiplier effect. And there are some efforts, but there's definitely not as much attention as needed for those domestic, homegrown solutions and ways to mobilize resources.
Yeah. So very quickly, Godwin, how have indigenous miners like yourself, line-based miners, for that matter, contributed to domestic capital formation, and in what ways do you think African states, the Ghanaian state to be precise, in your case, can help you mobilize more domestic capital?
Okay, I think first of all we should look at the local contents within the supply chain where we leave this in terms of supplies, both upstream, midstream, and downstream, for indigenous people to that space should be given to them. So that is number one. Number two, the artisanal and small-scale miners should not be looked at as just artisanal. They need to grow to medium and large scale. Because if you look at the small-scale mining sector, the incomes that we get stays in the country, and then the multiplier effect is there for everyone to see. Number two, because they are indigenous, they reinvest into their communities, and you see hotels coming up which are owned by small-scale miners. You have other businesses that comes from the small-scale mining sector, because this is where we are coming from. The profit we make, we invest it in our community. So government should have a conscious policy in place to grow the sector, small-scale miners. I can say maybe every region, I'm getting one miner that will grow from small, medium to a large scale, so that they participate at the top level with the multinationals. In that way, you retain a lot of value in country and create more domestic champions, which also creates value in terms of that. Then we need to also look at value addition. We export everything raw. Why? We build local capacity to add value. Industry and then the miners should work together to bring that value. Else our people will continue to go after where their resources have gone. That's why you see a lot of young men traveling on the Mediterranean Sea with all this peril and dying in the process. If we don't add value, we export businesses and job opportunities outside, and the youth will not stay. They all leave to where the resources are moved to.
Thank you so much, Mr. Godwin. I think this feedback, reminds me of the ways in which, the Chilean government grew its small-scale mining operatives in the 1960s around copper mining, so that today most of the large-scale mining companies are indigenously owned by Chileans, and thus copper is now responsible for, I think, 10% of Chile's GDP, compared to a country like Zambia, where copper contributes, I think, a meager 3%. So that's a really good point. So that brings us to the end of the conversation, and I think a lot of you have very interesting questions to ask. How many minutes do we have for the Q&A? Is it 15 minutes, 20 minutes? 15 minutes. Okay. So 15 to 20. Okay, that's okay. So any questions from the audience? Okay, so you mention your name and maybe your department before you ask your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Chokai Makari. I'm here with the LSE Africa Summit team. This has been a great panel. I kind of had a question. You just brought it up pertaining to the Zambian copper belt. I think we kind of talked about one of the main issues is not only just the resource curse, but the dependence factor. And according to the IGC, even though it's like the third most growing or third highest portion of their GDP, and it's been very, very prosperous, accounts for I think almost a quarter of it. It's been the one that's been declining the most. So in this particular scenario, what do you guys advise in terms of diversification? Is that something that needs to happen immediately, or is that something that you kind of phase out? And in a sector such as mining, how would you phase that out over time when it contributes to such a large portion of the economy? Thank you.
All right, so maybe we take two more questions for the first round. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Kika. I'm from Congo. I'm also a PhD student in Cambridge. So my question is not really about the theories and economics around this, but more on the resource curse. because as a Congolese, I know nothing about resource curse.
Can you speak directly to the mic so we can hear you?
Yeah, as a Congolese, I know a little about the resource curse because my country has been in a mess for my whole existence, literally. So we know we have these armed groups in the country, which are deep within the country, but they still are able to get ammunition and to maintain whichever they are holding within the country, which means someone is providing this, which means some forces are playing, and this has been maintained over the years.
Yeah.
So my question is really just about your different experiences coming from these different countries, which are also resource rich, and being actors in this kind of field. Do these forces exist?
Say that again?
Do these forces, which are maintaining the status quo in these resource-rich countries, really exist? And who are they? Because it's like my government doesn't know. My people we don't know. But it's very frustrating that you were born in a region, your whole life you have known only wars. And there is nothing is showing this stopping anytime soon.
Okay, thank you so much. So your question is, do the forces that maintain the status quo, and by status quo you mean the resource curse, exist? Okay, thank you. The last question. Okay, so you are just close to him, so. Oh, all right, okay, you have the mic ready. Go for it.
Hello, my name is Ruben Elendo. I'm also a fellow Congolese from the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Okay.
My question is, I'm aware that green technology has been a topic that's been spoken on for the last 5 years. I went to the YTO public forum. It was a big discussion. But as you know, there are also implications concerning this. Also, whether it's informal or formal, there are always going to be implications concerning mining. But one discussion I believe that needs to be held into account is the private security companies that are also being taken place in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I'm also an observer from the International Code of Conduct Association, where we take into account private security companies who are essentially looking to actually abuse international human rights. So what can private security companies do to actually ensure that they are following governance, but also making sure that they are taking account into the country itself? What can the United Nations also do as well? But most importantly, how can we just raise awareness concerning this issue? Because countries are always being affected concerning the interest of corporations, and we need to take into account the countries itself.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so we've taken 3 questions for the first round, and we take 3 questions for the next round. We just want to be able to work within the 15-minute Q&A. So you go up there for the second round. Okay, thank you. So the first question was about diversification of minerals, particularly copper in Zambia, and how that can contribute to Africa's growth trajectory. And I think Dr. Amil has written a lot about that in terms of diversification of minerals. So maybe you might want to give that a step.
Your interesting question. Maybe the point is not to phase out copper, but to grow the rest. No. Let's not forget that natural resources are an asset, and it's a means to something. It's not an end, right? And so in the context of economic development, the point is what else? What are the productive capabilities that you build through them? Some of them will be around the natural resources, some of them will be transversal linkages to something else, but the important part is not to over-depend, right, on a single commodity. And that's why the most we always talk about critical minerals and critical materials, but the most critical thing in that process is the policy, right? And if you look at African green industrialization as a whole, the most critical asset is human capital, right? If you think of Korea industrialization, industrialization is not really about its natural resources. Same in China, they do have it, right? But it's not really the only thing that drives this process. And on the African continent, my sense is that sometimes we focus too much on the natural resources as the kind of, it's supposed to be an enabler, but let it not be the cap that limits the ambitions, right? To say, you have this, so that's what you can do, right? As opposed to really thinking from a holistic perspective and what makes sense.
Great. So, Godwin, maybe if you can add a bit to that question, how are you as a small-scale miner diversifying? Are you even doing it, and how are you doing it?
Okay. Before then, let me add something to the Congo, because I was at Kolwezi and the North Kivu and all that. I ask myself, who are the people benefiting from the conflict? Do you
Okay, so you're
understand?
answering the second question
Yes,
now. Okay, that's
who are
fine.
the people benefiting from the conflict?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you have companies still sourcing, companies still mining, and where does it go? So the issue of traceability, when it comes to the DRC, I don't see it there. These minerals end up to the international market, and it clearly speaks about the hypocrisy of the West in terms of when it comes to issues of traceability. There's non-disclosure, bribery, corruption, and non-transparency in the dealings, mostly in DRC. And the continent itself, that's why I say we don't have a plan. We are looking at ourselves as units in silos. We are working in silos. We need to work together. We need to work together and help DRC, because DRC has all the resources that can change the continent. When it comes to hydropower, we can get it from the DRC. When it comes to everything is there, but the conflict, and it's being fueled by those who benefit from this conflict. So we need to work together. Then when it comes to diversification, as I said earlier on, within the ASM sector, myself, my company, we are working together with another jeweler called Sikapa, and what and then working with some from Zambia. They are into what we call they polish stones.
Yeah.
These low-end stones. So they bring some to us. We work together and come out with jewelry and all that to sell. So now from the mine, I can give you my gold, which is traceable, because we put all the system in place for us to come out with the jewelry that you can trace it to the source. So it's also, adding in terms of our incomes level, because if you take 1 kilo of gold and you sell it raw, you'll be getting about 90, depending on the $90,000. But depending upon the craftsmanship and the work that's done, this same jewelry 1 kilo could go up to $500,000 in terms of adding value based on the certification and
Right.
also the craftsmanship.
Great.
That is, so
Great.
these are some of the areas that we can add value.
Thank you so much. Josephine, can you probably answer the third question, which is the role that private security companies play in places like the DRC? What can private security companies do to promote governance? How about intergovernmental organizations such as the UN, etc., etc.?
Okay. I will not directly answer on the DRC
that's fine.
involvement because I
That's
have
okay.
no experience on that. But I think I will bring it on to the area that I have been involved in for the last couple of years, the area of business and human rights. So basically, on business and human rights, we will be saying that businesses in their operations and their dealings, they have responsibilities to respect the rights of people and to act in a manner that does not violate the rights of people that they are involved with. So within this area, we have seen a lot of guidelines that have been developed, like the UN guidelines on business and human rights, that have been developed in 2011. And within that framework of the UN guidelines of business and human rights, there has been some guidelines on how that applies in conflict regions like the Congo. So I think that looking at that aspect of and that guidance might help in terms of advocacy and pushing for private security companies and the companies that engage them to change their conduct. And also on private security, there are what are called the voluntary guidelines on security and human rights. These are guidelines which speculate how can security, including private security, can be done in a manner that respects human rights, and it includes issues of training of the security forces on how to respect the rights of people, and also issues of due diligence, how a company can conduct its own due diligence to see where they need to change and need to collaborate. And with the voluntary principle, they are not binding. That's the challenge. All these are just principles that are voluntary, that are not necessarily binding. So you have to find ways as civil society groups, as activists, as academics, and practitioners to make them enforceable. So for instance, I know of organizations in Southern Africa that are working in Mozambique to have the government of Mozambique before the conflict and violence happened after the last election, to enact some of the principles from the voluntary security and human rights into law, domestic laws that can be held enforceable. And with the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, we have conducted some trainings for some private security companies on human rights, how they can, their understanding of human rights and how they can conduct their work. So those are some of the things and actions that can be taken. But at the international level, in terms of international human rights law, it's mostly states that the international human rights framework binds states to respect human rights and not necessarily companies and private security, unfortunately. So.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. So I think we're running out of time, and so I will take 2 questions from the top and 1 more question here because we have a lot more people seated here compared to those at the top. So, yeah.
Thank you guys for the talk today. Dr. Amir, you talked about Africa needing to have a vision for green industrialization. So curious to know what your vision would be. And then to your point on visions veering into hallucinations, what's a realistic vision? Because there's obviously trade-offs in development. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Something that seems to be missing from the conversation is around biodiversity goals and trajectories. And I'm wondering, how can these be reconciled with advancements in mining and resource extraction across the continent?
Sorry, ask your question again.
Biodiversity.
Okay, you got it right. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Maybe 1 more question for those down below here.
I have a mic.
Okay, we take 4 questions. 1 more question from the audience group down here and 1 more up there. Yeah. Who has the mic? Okay.
I have the mic.
Yeah. Okay. Go for it.
Thank you. My name is David. I come from Uganda. My question is about the informal mining sector. Just want to check, how does corruption contribute to poor governance in the informal mining sector? And how does corruption contribute to mining sector being a curse to each of the countries? Probably different examples we're giving. Thank you.
1 question up there, and that'll be 4. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, all the speakers for the talk. I'm from South Africa. My question is, all of you guys kind of touched to some extent of this disconnect between the people on the ground, what they need, what their skills are, and what government policy is and how it can facilitate those skills to transform the economy. What do you guys think is needed to bridge that gap, and what's missing that governments are not doing to be able to do that?
Okay, thank you so much. So I think this will be our last round of questions, wouldn't it? Would it? Okay, thank you. So the first question is about Africa's vision for industrialization, which was specifically directed to Dr. Abil.
So I'll answer that and the other one's addressed. So actually I'll start with the last one and finish.
Okay, that's okay.
Biodiversity, very important, but it goes to, again, the conversation of agency, of countries, communities determining what's the most valuable assets that they have, and becomes a cost-benefit analysis. So sometimes your natural resources are in areas where you also have extreme biodiversity, and it becomes a question, what's more valuable, right, if you destroy that biodiversity to extract that asset? And historical experiences show that sometimes nature is a lot more valuable, but it's not well accounted into financial accounting measures, or even the value of natural resources. There are countries that destroy their biodiversity and then run out of natural resources like mining because they're non-renewable, right?
Yeah. And
biodiversity has great value, not least as a source of innovation, as a source of information, and there's a lot of work on the kind of, the economics of biodiversity that is extremely, extremely important. That links to the kind of questions on how to align. I think the one word that hasn't been mentioned, that I think, and I'm biased, that is very important, is industrial policy. Because this is basically states intervening to prioritize some sectors and activities over others, and that's part of their plan, right, in terms of and it takes a vision of society, of what kind of jobs you want to create, at what skill level, and how do you see your country moving forward, And so industrial policy is an extremely important topic, and many people are working on those on the African continent. And linking to the very last question, vision, the one point I'll bring up, and I know this is a matter close to many people, at the heart of many people in the room, and then not least David, is regional coordination. I'm convinced that there is a big glass ceiling of what can be achieved in green industrialization and structural transformation in Africa at the national level, right? With national level thinking. Because all of the assets that are spread across the continent, from where you find the critical minerals, different types of critical minerals, from where you have manufacturing capabilities in South Africa, where you can produce renewables at the lowest cost, where you're close to trade routes. And all of these assets can be leveraged as part of really strong, efficient, developmental regional supply chains. But if you only think national level, you have to deal with just a portion of the fact. And that leads to the forces that you mentioned that maintain the resource curse. There's a big strategy of divide and conquer. Of course, you don't have leverage if DRC only sees what it has. But if you start to think of regionally, if there's negotiations at the regional level, then you can attract much better terms for investment, for financing, because people depend even more on your natural resources. And I'll just end on this African proverb. I think it comes from perhaps Burkina Faso, or sometimes associated to other places. It's if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. Yeah. So this is a great lesson for industrial policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Godwin, could you answer the question on the role of corruption, how corruption contributes to poor governance in the mining sector?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think you're looking at, let me give an example in Ghana. You are looking at about 1 million people working, estimated 1 million people working directly in the ASM subsector. And also if you look at the dependents, you are looking at close to 4.5 million. This, when you turn it out into votes, it really counts. So you realize that government in its way pretends to fight against illegality and land degradation because of the fear of votes. So this is one thing. Yes, I remember the past government tried fighting against illegal mining and then degradation and all that. And most of the seats around these mining areas, they lost those seats. So now it's like, we will not talk much about it. So let's pretend as if we are doing something, but at the end of the day, we end up not doing anything. You realize the military intervention also, there's so much corruption, the allegations where military officers were bribed, so you get to, when they are about, after planning, instead of them moving to the areas that the degradation is taking place to ensure that there is sanity, before they get there, you don't find any legal operated information leaks to them, and they leave the place before they come. So these are also sort of corruption. And then the state institutions also are ill-equipped, and there is an inadequate in terms of logistics for them to apply. And the formal way of applying license also, it used to be who you know and all that, which there are issue of corruption. But technology, with the introduction of what we call the mineral cadastre administrative system, where you can use your laptop and all that, the phones to do that have really reduced that sort of human interface. So you can do everything online. But the signing aspects also get to the minister and becomes an issue of challenge. So we realize that there are what we call the Goro boys in Ghana, the middlemen in there who take money from people, and at the end of the day, they go and sign some of these licenses for them. So corruption has really made, and then government interference within state institutions have rendered most of the state institutions unprofessionals in their dealing, because they know we have to do this way, but because there is influence from government, it makes them, so sometimes you realize that it becomes difficult to be a professional when there is this sort of interference. So these are some part and parcel of the challenge, and how corruption have really rendered some of them not being
great. Thank you so much, Godwin. So Josephine, if you could wrap up this conversation by answering or maybe adding up to the question about the disconnect between the people on the ground, informal miners or the artisanal miners, and government policy, and what can be done to bridge this gap.
Thank you. I think the disconnect also emerges from the fact that governments do not recognize or do not want to recognize that there is a problem, like with informal miners, right? They see it from they see it as a problem that needs to be, dealt with the law in terms of the arrest and remove the people, but do not recognize that, informal mining happens for a reason, and also it contributes to their economies. So based off on that, they are not taking time to engage with those who are involved in the informal mining. So I would suggest that going forward, what would help is most of the artisanal and small-scale miners, whether they are doing it legally or illegally, most of them have formed, like in Zimbabwe, have formed associations that they identify with or that they can be engaged with through. So I would suggest maybe governments can start engagement with the informal miners through those associations to also hear about their views, what they consider the best way to be formalized or included in the formal economy. So that would be my suggestion. And I just want to add one bit on visions and everything. The African Union, through the African Mining Development Center, recently published an African Green Mineral Strategy. I think it was last week or the week before last. So I think in terms of the vision for Africa, in terms of the green minerals, how to diversify the economy, not just focusing on mining alone, but making it permeate other industrial areas, and also the issue of biodiversity that have been talked about. It sort of touches on all those issues and how transparency and information sharing and things like that would help curb issues of corruption and illegality that is happening in there. So I think it's a policy document that has involved so much thought, so much work and engagement among the African experts that would need implementation. If African governments can come together, like Dr. Amir was saying, to collaboratively implement it at national and regional level, it can change how Africa negotiate, or even engage with other regions when it comes to its green minerals.
Right.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think I would like to add my voice to the various answers. Particularly, I can understand why the gentleman from South Africa will ask that question in terms of the disconnect between small-scale miners and policy. In Tanzania, Magufuli engaged a lot with informal miners, and there's a political and economic imperative for wanting to do that. Political because the opposition was gaining a lot more foothold in Tanzania, and most of the miners obviously are sensitive to which message political parties were giving to them, and so Magufuli wanted to contain the opposition's presence, particularly in the northern parts of the country, where small-scale mining is also prevalent. In South Africa, the Zama, as you call them, have really been, neglected, I think, by the LSE. But some people have argued that over time, as the EFF, which gets a lot of votes from black voters who also happen to be the Zama population, maybe the ANC will begin to pay attention to the needs of the small-scale miners. So there's a way in which politics can shape the kind of policies or economic policies governments can take towards small-scale miners. With that said, I would like to thank you so much. And sorry if you couldn't have the chance to ask your question, but thank you.
No. Let's give him a round of applause. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Isaac Aruna-Zihaba, for bringing realism into this conversation and for leading it so masterfully. We deeply appreciate that. And thank you, Josephine. Thank you, Amir. And also thank you, Godwin, for being a part of this panel. Let's give them another round of applause.
Thank you so much. And Eid Mubarak to those celebrating it.